A corrupt cop, a wrongful arrest, and a humiliating setup. But what he didn't know? The woman he was trying to take down was about to take him down instead. Before we dive in, I have one question for you. Should corrupt cops be exposed? If your answer is yes, comment 1 and hit that subscribe button. If you believe justice should always prevail, smash that like button. And trust me, watch until the end, because the moment this officer realizes who he just arrested will leave you speechless. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. The streets of Westwood Heights were quiet, too quiet for his liking. This was the kind of neighborhood he believed needed protection, from people who didn't belong, and to him that was clear as day. Then he saw it. A sleek black Mercedes gliding smoothly down the road, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. Behind the wheel sat a black woman, her posture straight, her tailored blazer crisp, her expression unreadable. She moved like she owned the road, like she had every right to be there. That was enough for Reynolds. His lips curled into a smirk as he reached for the patrol lights. "Let's see who she really is," he muttered, flipping the siren for a single burst. The woman pulled over with controlled precision. Too controlled. No panic. No hesitation. That irritated him even more. He stepped out, heavy boots hitting the pavement, hand already resting near his holster. The power in moments like these? He lived for it. "License and registration," he barked. She didn't flinch. Instead, she handed over her documents with a quiet confidence that made his teeth clench. Reynolds barely glanced at her name. Jasmine Carter. Didn't matter. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Carter?" His voice dripped with condescension. Jasmine met his gaze, steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" There would be. Jasmine Carter's wrists burned. The handcuffs were too tight, deliberately so. Officer Mark Reynolds had made sure of that. He gripped her arm with unnecessary force, dragging her through the precinct like a trophy. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and stale coffee, but beneath it, an unspoken tension simmered. Officers glanced up from their desks, conversations halting mid-sentence as they took in the sight before them. A well-dressed black woman being paraded in like a criminal. Reynolds' smirk stretched wider. He wanted them to see. "Got ourselves another one," he called out, his voice laced with mock satisfaction. "Caught her with possession. Real shame." A murmur rippled through the room. Some exchanged knowing looks. Others barely reacted. They had seen this play out before. Reynolds had done it before. But something was off this time. Jasmine wasn't pleading. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fighting. She was waiting. Sergeant David Morales stepped forward, his eyes flicking between Reynolds and Jasmine. "You sure about this?" His voice was level, but there was something sharp underneath. Reynolds scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Morales didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze settled on Jasmine. She held his stare, unshaken. There was no panic in her eyes, only something cold, something calculated. Morales had been on the force long enough to recognize it. This wasn't a woman caught in a bad situation. This was a woman who knew exactly what was coming next. And then it happened. The precinct doors swung open with a force that rattled the room. Deputy Chief Nathan Owens strode in, his presence like a thunderclap in a quiet storm. Officers instinctively straightened, tension mounting with every step he took. His gaze swept the room, locking onto Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds," he said, voice low and edged with steel. "Release her." The precinct fell into stunned silence. Reynolds blinked. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Sir, with all due respect, this woman—" Owens cut him off. "Captain Carter," he corrected. "Your new commanding officer." The words detonated in the room like a bomb. Reynolds' smirk vanished. His face drained of color, his grip on Jasmine's arm faltering. He turned to the other officers, searching for some confirmation that this was a mistake, a cruel joke. But no one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what he had just done pressed down on him, crushing and suffocating. Jasmine Carter, still cuffed, lifted her chin, her voice calm but slicing through the silence like a blade. "I'd suggest you take these off," she said, holding up her restrained wrists. "Unless you want to add unlawful detainment of your superior officer to your list of mistakes." Reynolds's hands twitched. His mind screamed at him to fix this, to take control. But control had already slipped through his fingers. And for the first time in his career, he was the one who couldn't breathe. Did you see that moment? The second Reynolds realized he had just destroyed himself? But trust me, this is only the beginning. What do you think will happen next? Will he try to talk his way out? Or is his fate already sealed? Drop number 1 in the comments if you're hooked, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. The precinct felt like it had stopped breathing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the metallic click of Officer Mark Reynolds fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs around Jasmine Carter's wrists. The moment the metal restraints fell away, Jasmine didn't rub at the red marks on her skin. She didn't flinch. Instead, she flexed her fingers slowly, methodically, as if reclaiming her power inch by inch. Then she took a single step forward, closing the distance between her and the man who had just humiliated her. "You never even asked," she said, her voice dangerously quiet but cutting through the tension like a razor. Reynolds swallowed hard. You saw a black woman in a nice car," she continued, eyes locked onto him. "And that was all it took. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I was doing. You didn't even hesitate before slamming me against my car, before yanking me out like I was some threat you had to eliminate." Reynolds' jaw clenched. "That's not—" Her voice sharpened. "You didn't think twice before planting evidence, did you?" A ripple went through the room. Officers shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Others stood frozen, their gazes flicking between Carter and Reynolds, waiting to see how this would unfold. Reynolds' nostrils flared. He could feel the scrutiny closing in on him, pressing against his skin like a vice. "I don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "Don't you?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was nothing more than a pathetic specimen under a microscope. And then, her gaze flicked past him, to them, to the officers surrounding them. "To all of you," she said, her voice rising now, commanding the room. "How many of you stood by and watched? How many of you have seen him do this before and said nothing?" The murmurs grew louder. Tension thickened like a storm about to break. Sergeant Morales took a slow step forward, his face unreadable. "We need to check the dash cam footage," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of something irreversible. Reynolds whipped around, his pulse spiking. "You can't be serious." His voice was too loud, too frantic. Morales' expression didn't change. "If you did nothing wrong, you've got nothing to worry about." But Reynolds knew. He knew before the footage even played, before his own voice filled the precinct, barking orders, sneering, escalating, until the moment his hand slipped under Jasmine's seat. Silence, a crushing, absolute silence. And just like that, Officer Mark Reynolds realized he was done. The silence in the precinct was suffocating. Every officer stood frozen, their eyes locked onto the screen as the damning footage played. Officer Mark Reynolds' voice boomed from the speakers, dripping with arrogance as he barked orders at Jasmine Carter. The video captured everything, the way he yanked her from the car, the smirk on his face, the unnecessary force he used to slam her against the vehicle. And then, the moment that sealed his fate, his hand slipping under the driver's seat, fingers barely visible before a small plastic bag conveniently appeared. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone cursed under their breath. A few officers turned away, unable to keep watching. Reynolds' pulse pounded in his ears. His breath came short and fast. This is taken out of context," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand." Deputy Chief Nathan Owens stepped forward, his face unreadable. "I understand perfectly," he said, his voice like a hammer to stone. Reynolds' panic flared. His eyes darted toward his fellow officers, the men who had always had his back, the ones who had covered for him before. But they weren't meeting his gaze. Some looked away. Others watched him with a mixture of disappointment and something even worse, contempt. "You set me up," Reynolds spat, pointing a trembling finger at Jasmine. "This is a setup." Jasmine took a slow, deliberate step forward, her expression unwavering. "No, Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of justice itself. "This is accountability." Owens let the silence linger, the weight of Reynolds unraveling, filling every inch of the room. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "Hand over your badge and weapon." Reynolds' world tilted. His fingers twitched at his sides. His brain screamed for a way out, for an excuse, for anything that could undo the last 5 minutes. He had always believed he was untouchable, that the system would protect him, that no matter what, he would never be the one standing on this side of justice. But now, the very badge that had shielded him was being stripped away. His hands shook as he reached for it, unclipping the metal from his chest. The weight of it was unbearable. His gun felt heavier than ever as he placed it on the desk with a dull clunk. Owens turned to 2 waiting officers. "Escort him out." 2 firm hands gripped Reynolds' arms, men he had once called brothers. They weren't on his side anymore. They weren't looking at him as a cop, as a fellow officer. They were looking at him like what he was, a disgrace. As they dragged him toward the exit, the last thing he saw was Jasmine Carter standing tall, her presence unshakable. And in that moment, he knew. He hadn't just lost his job, he had destroyed himself. Justice has spoken, but is this truly the end for Reynolds? What happens when a man who thought he was untouchable finally faces consequences? Comment karma if you believe he got what he deserved, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next twist is even bigger. The precinct doors burst open, and the cold night air hit Officer Mark Reynolds like a slap. But it wasn't the wind that sent a chill through his body, it was the roar of the crowd. Hundreds of people lined the steps outside the station, their voices rising in a furious, relentless chant. "No more cover-ups, no more lies." The words pounded against Reynolds' skull, drilling into his skin, his bones, his soul. The same arrogance he had worn like a shield all these years was gone now, stripped away along with his badge. His hands clenched into fists, his face rigid as the 2 officers on either side of him tightened their grip. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, reporters hurled questions at him like bullets. "Officer Reynolds, do you deny the allegations? How many innocent people have you done this to? Do you expect criminal charges?" Reynolds kept his jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say that could save him. And then, the final blow. Jasmine Carter stepped onto the precinct steps, her posture straight, her gaze cutting through him like a blade. When she spoke, her voice carried over the crowd, not just a statement, but a reckoning. "This isn't just about me," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is about every person who has been humiliated, falsely accused, and silenced by people like him." The crowd erupted. Cheers, shouts, raw emotion flooded the streets. Reynolds' breath stuttered. He had spent years believing the public's outrage didn't matter, that no matter how loud they got, the system would always protect him. But now he was the one being paraded through the streets in disgrace. His eyes darted to his former colleagues still standing in the precinct doorway. Some looked on with quiet satisfaction. Others watched in uneasy silence. Not one of them stepped forward to defend him. Not one of them offered a hand, because they all knew the truth. Reynolds had been a protected man for years, untouchable, shielded by his badge and the culture of silence that let officers like him thrive. But today that shield had shattered. Deputy Chief Owens turned to Sergeant Morales. "Make sure the paperwork is in order," he said firmly. "Reynolds is officially suspended, pending a full investigation." Morales gave a sharp nod. "And if the evidence holds?" Owens' expression was cold, unyielding. "Then we make sure justice is served." Reynolds felt the last ounce of control slip from his grasp. As he was shoved into the waiting squad car, the weight of every life he had ruined, every injustice he had committed without consequence, came crashing down. And standing just beyond the flashing cameras, watching it all unfold, was Jasmine Carter, stronger than ever. Justice had come for Mark Reynolds, but the fight was far from over. The precinct was different now. The air felt heavier, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on every officer who had witnessed it. Mark Reynolds was gone, dragged out in disgrace, but the echoes of his actions remained, lingering like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Jasmine Carter stood in the center of it all. She could feel the stares, the tension rolling off her colleagues in waves, some watching in silent approval, others masking their discomfort. She knew what they were thinking. Some saw her as justice finally served, others saw her as a threat. Sergeant Morales stepped forward, arms crossed. "You know this isn't over, right?" Jasmine met his gaze, unwavering. "Good," she said, "because I didn't come here to keep things the way they were." Morales exhaled through his nose, a hint of something that wasn't quite amusement but wasn't far from it either. "Then you're in the right place." Outside, the chants still raged. Inside, officers exchanged uneasy glances. Jasmine turned, walking toward the desk that once belonged to Reynolds. It wasn't just a desk now. It was a symbol. She pulled out the chair, sat down, and let the room adjust to a new reality. She was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. In 2025, accountability in law enforcement is no longer just a demand. It's an expectation. The world is watching, cameras are always rolling, and officers who abuse their power can no longer hide behind their badges. Jasmine Carter's story is more than just one corrupt cop facing justice. It's a wake-up call. How many more officers like Mark Reynolds are out there? How many innocent lives have been destroyed because the system turned a blind eye? This is a fight that isn't over. With Jasmine now in a position of leadership, she has the power to change the culture from within. But the question remains, will the department stand with her, or will they resist the reckoning she represents? Now it's your turn. Do you believe Jasmine Carter has what it takes to clean up the system from the inside? Comment below with your thoughts. Should she push for deeper reforms, expose more corruption, or focus on building trust within the community? Like and share this video if you stand for justice. Because one victory isn't enough. Real change takes all of us. What should Jasmine's next move be? Let's talk about it.